Hi, everyone. I want to thank the host for her energy in bringing everybody back together. And I'm very sorry I'm not able to be there in person. My name's Heather Casselden. I hold the Impact Chair in Transformative Governance for Planetary Health at the University of Victoria. And I'm going to be speaking today just about why I think, and I think a lot of people are starting to recognize the importance of Indigenous people's ways of being and how they are vital to planetary health and how they need to be prioritized in climate policy. Just for a bit of context, and I'm sorry I'm not able to get my camera on today, I am a white settler and a health researcher. My ancestors are Scottish and English, and I share that with you because we as white people need to acknowledge our whiteness and how our whiteness permeates our ways of seeing and structuring the world to our benefit, and how we see and treat others who are not white in the world, and how we structurally disadvantage, disinclude, and deny them their fundamental human and health rights. And I want to ask those who are in the audience who identify as white to think about that for a minute and to ask yourselves, how does your whiteness privilege you and limit your own professional as well as personal responses to climate change and health? Ask yourselves honestly, what stereotypes do you have about Indigenous peoples? And how do these racist stereotypes, as well as our institutionally structured policies, programs, and practices, prevent us from making space or moving over to make way for Indigenous people's ways of being, which are so vital to planetary health, and how we must prioritize Indigenous philosophies and Indigenous science in climate policy and action? And while I'm calling on white people to think about your whiteness and how that might make you feel uncomfortable, and for me to even use, the phrase of how do our racist stereotypes inhibit our abilities to be in good relationship in the world? I know that no one wants to be thought of as racist, and engaging in anti-racist thinking and being is an ongoing process, one of which I will endeavor to engage with for the rest of my life. But being uncomfortable right now is necessary. We are uncomfortable anyways because the temperature is rising. The storms, as we saw last week in your landscape and out here this past year in British Columbia, are surging. And this is just the beginning. We cannot stick our heads in the sand. We need to look up and look around for solutions. And we can find them in the sciences and practices of Indigenous peoples who live in symbiotic relations with the ecosystems they are a part of. And we need to respectfully engage with Indigenous peoples to learn how to be better global citizens. As a bit of further background to who I am, I've lived in multiple Indigenous territories across this country, and I've received teaching from many generous and patient Indigenous elders and knowledge keepers over the past 2 decades. I'm grateful right now to live and work, albeit as an uninvited occupier, in the traditional territories of Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Esquimalt, the Songhees, and the Wasanich First Nations. And I acknowledge and respect, and I have deep appreciation for their and other Indigenous peoples' close and continuing relationships to the land and waters that surround us. And I'm committed to a lifelong learning process of how to be a good guest here. I'm committing to practices that address Indigenous-specific structural, systematic, and everyday violence of colonialism and racism. I'm also committed to supporting Indigenous rights, resurgence, and self-determination, and I hope that this helps to situate where I'm coming from today. Limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels has become the clarion call to scientists around the globe and to governments, industry, and all of humanity. And I don't think I'm saying anything new to the audience today. The urgent lens of the Anthropocene presents an urgent, the unifying lens of the Anthropocene presents an urgent and daunting guide to us towards an integrated, sustainable governance regime that will require human action across food, water, energy, and climate systems at all scales, from the individual to the global. But despite us knowing this, the health of our planet is still in crisis, and it's driven by dominant paradigms of colonization, capitalism, extractivism, globalization, and racism. And it's underpinned by those same sorts of concomitant policies, systems, and structures that reinforce these worldviews. If we want collective futures that sustain all planetary life, we need to respond with urgency and creativity across political and epistemic boundaries towards reconciling the damage we have done to the planet's health and ourselves and all of our relations. In spite of widespread appeals for deep systems change, decision makers have yet to step into actions and corresponding policies of transformational system change. And this is in part because, and I'm quoting from Otto Scharmer's research, because systems are designed to optimize the status quo. You cannot change a system unless you transform consciousness. You cannot transform consciousness unless you make a system sense and see itself. You cannot do these things at scale unless you create new forms of deep learning structures. And this sensing and seeing are powerful attributes of Indigenous ways of being. Indigenous peoples are raising distinct questions and generating innovative responses to the challenges their communities face. Yet, Indigenous knowledge is often only an afterthought, if thought of at all. A decolonized and relational approach to systems thinking is key to create transformational change and tackle the challenges of climate change and other related crises of the Anthropocene, including things like the COVID pandemic. And for those in the audience who aren't really familiar with the concept of decolonizing, it's the process of undoing colonization. It involves continually, meaningfully changing our existing policies, practices, and structures, and giving up white settler colonial control and white supremacist ideologies. It also involves returning power of lands and life back to Indigenous peoples. Holistic sensing and seeing originates with Indigenous peoples, and it's been their way of knowing since time immemorial. Indigenous peoples have historical knowledges and practices in keeping with a healthy planet, in contrast to the extractive neoliberal systems we see dominating today. As rights holders with distinct worldviews, they are leading efforts to reconcile global environmental change. They are stewards of 80% of the planet's biodiversity. And recent research is demonstrating how Indigenous-led resurgence and resistance is successfully stopping or delaying greenhouse gas pollution equivalent to 1/4 of the annual US and Canadian emissions. Yet we demonize and criminalize their land defense. Despite expertise and leadership to mitigate ecological crises at multiple scales, Indigenous peoples remain marginalized in climate negotiations. At COP26 in Glasgow, hundreds observed that restrictions on access to these negotiations were unprecedented and unjust. What if instead of being forced into adversarial, legal, and frontline resistance, Indigenous ways of knowing were embraced as pathways towards the health of people and the planet? Indigenous knowledge systems are intrinsically interdisciplinary. A friend and colleague, Carrie Newman, who's Kwakwakawa Constolo, an artist and scholar, explains what this means to him. Indigenous knowledges are learned from the world around us through our relations with the land, air, water, plants, and animals. We form our understandings of engineering, mathematics, biology, astronomy, physics, and medicine.
Casselden, and now
these same relationships also help us to better understand the social, physical, and spiritual. At Potlatches, we address governance, legal and social orders, science, art, music, dance, and spirituality, which are all interdependent, reciprocal in a relationship with one another. And this way of connecting what we learn from nature to science to art and society exists along a perspective of time that extends our collective responsibility from long before we are born until generations after we die. This has been our normal, and from a Kwakwaka'wakw perspective, our normal since before the pyramids. It's only novel within Western paradigms. So I'm not necessarily sharing anything new, am I? I mean, many non-Indigenous scholars, artists, activists, decision makers do turn to Indigenous peoples for leadership in climate justice and policy, and they have done for a couple of decades. And if we think back to the 1987 Brundtland Report or the 1992 Biodiversity Convention, we see reference there. The problem, the transformational aspect of the resulting policies and actions remain weak because the deep understandings of systems across space, time, and cultures is lacking in non-Indigenous leadership. The mainstream literature on One Health and planetary health are being framed as new fields of science. But by doing so, we are continuing to erase existing and enduring Indigenous knowledge about the interconnectedness of all things. The Western conception of planetary health does not recognize, as my new friend and colleague, Nicole Redvers, has pointed out in her own writing, that the ways Indigenous knowledge have no clear separation between the health of the planet and the health of the self. This means that the meaning and applications of planetary health are directly rooted in community values based on protocols for living in harmony with all that have existed for thousands of years. Likewise, the current shift in policy direction towards net zero greenhouse gas emissions and the alluring veneer of nature-based solutions may seem like a promising new direction and way of addressing the climate crisis. But when these are considered in the context of whose land will still go unreturned and unrestored, and whose carbon pollution will be sequestered there, we see the continuation of a mentality that continues to benefit white settler society and causes harm to those whose stolen land we are on. A national Indigenous women's-led activist group, Indigenous Climate Action, has recently released a report about how nature-based solutions are deeply enmeshed in carbon offsetting and carbon markets, thus failing to address the root causes of climate change and potentially leading to new forms of corporate interests in colonizing Indigenous territories. So-called leaders in planetary health and nature-based solutions are continuing to privilege Western theories and approaches. When Indigenous knowledge is used, it's often misunderstood or selectively appropriated. It's not respected on its own terms. But by following principles like those embodied in the Nuchalnath principles of Hishuksawak, Uathluk, and Isak, which means essentially to live in good relationship with respect with the land, air, water, and everything in them, we can promote planetary health and sustainable futures. So how do we do this? Well, as an impact chair in transformative governance, I look at governance structures, and we can critically examine our structures and look at who is at the table, who's not at the table but needs to be there, and what tables exist outside of our awareness that we also need to be at. So who's driving the bus and who's holding decision-making power? What if our governance structures had 50% or more representation from Indigenous peoples? How would our climate policies look if that were the case? How would approaches to One Health or planetary health look like if that were the case? And we can think about it in the context of universities, from funding bodies to research teams to the outputs, and how do we share our knowledge? We would see a massive societal transformation from one that idolizes the economy to one that privileges the ecosystems that we're dependent on. It can happen if we take such a relational approach to governance. But I also recognize the process of relationship building with Indigenous peoples takes time. Are we willing to commit to this? It requires respect. Are we willing to commit to this? It calls for humility. Are we willing to commit to this? It calls for unlearning all that we have learned through our institutions, from public schools to universities. Are we willing to commit to this? And let's not forget the importance of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the key principle of free, prior, and informed consent. Transformative change requires addressing not only the symptoms, but also the underlying causes of problems. Such relational processes will not only change the questions that we pose, they will also generate new models for knowledge production and action that may hold the key to solving the global challenges associated with climate change that are staring us in the face. Coalitions of learners, researchers, and creatives are amplifying Indigenous leadership. It's already happening around the world in places that we might not think of around planetary health. As the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services concluded in 2019, and now we're at 2022, it's still a watershed moment. in acknowledging that Indigenous and local communities play a fundamental role in maintaining and managing biodiversity and landscapes that the rest of us can learn from. Through transformative change, nature can still be conserved and restored. This is also key to meeting most of our other global needs. By transformative change, we mean a fundamental, system-wide reorganization across technological, economic, political, and social factors, including paradigms, goals, and values. And with that, I thank you for letting me have an opportunity to share my thoughts, and I'm really looking forward to what Nicole and Hussein have to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Atlanite. I'm honored and humbled to be with everyone here today. I just want to acknowledge the beautiful traditional territories, unceded territories that we currently reside on, in addition to my own community territories. I'm a member of the Deninuqua First Nation, which is Treaty 8 territory in Denendeh, which is now called the Northwest Territories in Canada. I spent most of my life growing up within that area. I'm the daughter of a residential school survivor, in addition to the granddaughter of a residential school survivor and a niece as well to residential school survivors. And I very much carry that history with me today and continually have to fight to get my language and culture back because of what was stripped from my family and my roots. One of the things that's important, I think I can use this. Perfect. One of the things that's unusual when it comes to scientific presentations or conferences is seeing family members on a slide. As many of you may know, if you've been to scientific proceedings or conferences, it's very rare to personalize your experience as a part of your notations. However, as an Indigenous community member, the only reason why I'm here today is because of the roots and the relations that I carry with me. And I cannot go into any spaces without that root and relationship because for a number of reasons, with the most important being that it remains and ensures that I remain accountable to my people, to my lands, and my community. Because those are the people, those are the knowledges that have been held for thousands of years that I must honor continually. And by representing that relationality and the roots, it constantly reminds me of who I am, where I'm from, and the teachings that I've received as a part of that, but also ensures that I remain humble as a part of the knowledge that I've gained throughout my journey, and also the journey that many of my elders have just been a blessing in my life and the teachings that I've been able to receive. The other thing is that by locating myself in a purposeful way, it ensures that the stories that I speak from are not my own expertise. I'm not an expert within traditional knowledges. I'm not an expert within community knowledge. My knowledge is built on thousands of years of stories that have been transmitted through my people throughout time. And because of that, we remain as a part of that community as opposed to being held up for anything more. Now, I mentioned that much of that knowledge is passed on through stories, and stories are our method, if we could say, our research methodology, our clinical methodology, our methodology for living is through that pathway of stories. And I really like to share this quote from George Kajati because I think it really is emblematic of how story is embodied within our life. And he states that the culture's vitality is literally dependent on individuals in community with the natural world. Indigenous cultures are an extension of the story of the natural community of a place and evolve according to ecological dynamics and natural relationships. Therefore, I honor my ancestors and elders past, present, and future here and in all lands across this beautiful Mother Earth. You'll hear often that Indigenous research methodologies will sometimes be encapsulated within what's called 4 Rs, which is respect, which is relevance, which is reciprocity, which is responsibility. Each of those R's could have a month of teachings, could have a year of teachings on them. So by stating those 4 R's very superficially, very much minimizes the depth and the concepts that embody those terms practically within how we walk on the earth today, softly. Now, how we form our relationships within the world, which is one of those components when we think about that word relationality. And because of our relationships being fundamentally interconnected, and you'll hear this word often within spaces of Indigenous communities, interconnected. It may not be said interconnected, but the embodiment of what interconnected means is very much a part of the narratives and the stories and the teachings that are embodied through communities. And interconnectedness, we could say, is a basic fundamental law to the point of being a law within our communities. So if we think about this term interconnectedness, how can we embody that as a research methodology, as a clinical methodology, as a methodology for living, for ways of being? Well, of course, there's been a method in existence for thousands of years. However, due to Western scientific hegemony, those knowledges have been significantly and violently suppressed throughout hundreds and hundreds of years in many lands. I often use this word, and some folks have likely heard me say this before, which is epistemological pluralism. It's a big word, epistemological pluralism. But essentially what it embodies is that there's many different perspectives in the world, many different ways of knowing in the world. And we need all of those components to be able to get a true understanding of what the world is. There was a teaching that was given to me actually by one of my students, one of my PhD students in Indigenous health, and had shared a story about an elder, where the elder had said, you have one person on one side of the table, and you have another person on the other side of a table. And if you put a teacup in the middle of that table with the handle facing one person and the other side of the cup facing the other person, and if those two people have never seen a cup before, they would be asked to describe what they see, what their view of that cup is. And of course, the one person on the one side will describe the handle of the cup, the components that they see in the shape, and then the other person will describe the smooth part of the cup. Now, if they didn't know about the other side of the cup, who's right in that respect? You need the multiple views and perspectives to be able to understand the reality of the world that's embodied within what is called life. So why does this matter? And I often show this picture too, because it really depicts how the world has changed. We've went from a very square and synthetic worldview, because once it was a natural, holistic, and circular worldview. But this worldview affects how we create research questions, how we operationalize problems, solutions, and so on and so forth. One of the things when we think about how we sit within the world, what our hierarchy is of humans, this thought process of what we embody here within this picture. And I'll often tell people, just look at that picture and see how it makes you feel in your body when you look at it. There's an elder by the name of Bessa Blondin, who's a Dene Satu elder. She was born in 1949, birthed in the bush in a canvas tent by her grandfather on the north shores of Great Bear Lake within the Northwest Territories. And she has shared that her grandfather, when she was a young girl, told her of a time within her lifetime that she would experience where the ground would start sinking upon itself. And now we start to see that the permafrost is rapidly thawing within our traditional homelands, and the ground is caving in upon itself. She was told stories about how the world would tip slightly, its axis going off end. And here now we have scientists confirming that the Earth is in fact tilting due to the weight distribution effects that occur because of the polar melts at the tops of the Earth. She was told of a time where a great sickness would wake up from the ice, and now we see viruses and bacteria that have been dormant within the permafrost coming. And in fact, there was a family within Siberia that was killed because of anthrax bacteria that was released from a melting animal. These are the stories, the prophecies that we called, that our grandparents were sharing through generations, and we're seeing the reality of these effects today. She was told those stories decades ago, and here we see them emblematic today. Now, Heather did a good job of explaining some of the parameters around planetary health, and there's been a very big push within the movement to ensure that the encapsulation of this term planetary health is more open to ensuring that it's not only a focus on humans, but also on all the other relations that exist within our world. And because of that, the Planetary Health Alliance has redefined their definition of planetary health just as of last year as a solutions-oriented transdisciplinary field and social movement focused on analyzing and addressing the impacts of human disruptions to Earth's natural systems, on human health, and all health on Earth, and all life on Earth, sorry. One of the things that Heather did a great job of was talking about how planetary health, One Health, and many of the concepts are very much a Western construct, because in our traditional teachings, as she noted, there's no separation between the planet and ourselves. We are completely interconnected. There was a Maori gentleman who had told me a story about him presenting to scientists. And he had told them that their origin stories were that they came from the mountain, that they came from the river and the mountain that was near his territories. And what he asked the folks within the room, and he said, well, where do you get your drinking water from? And they said, well, the tap. And he said, no, further than that. Where do you get your drinking water from? Oh, the water treatment plant. No, further back than that. Where do you get your water from? The water comes from the river. Where does the river come from? The river comes from the mountain. 60% of your body is made of water, which means you are the river from that mountain. You are absolutely and fundamentally interconnected with nature. Imagine how far that journey of those water molecules have had. The wisdom that's inside all of you because of the journey of every single molecule that you have within your body. You'll often hear Indigenous people talk about being star people. We're from the stars. Many people may know that all of the elements within our body, particularly the carbon elements, came from long exploded stars. We are star people. So these stories are not just mythology. There's a physiological basis for the interconnectedness that we have as being Indigenous people from the land. And we see this because of our positionality within the community as being one of a larger system, as opposed to being on top of a hierarchy in this ego-I perspective. We are eco, we are we. And we've forgotten as a community that we are part of an integrative system. Now, we use terms within our traditional languages, and we try our best to encapsulate these within the English language. And I often talk about what we call Earth-centered jurisprudence, which is basically that the systems that govern both nature and also our global systems are the same. There's actually a unity between the natural laws that exist between us because of those interconnectivities that I talked about. So in this vision that we see for a healthy future, we really need to start breaking down this dissonance that occurs of I'm going out into nature. I'm going for a walk in nature. Comparatively to being in and of nature. You are nature. This is represented through what we call natural law, first law. You'll hear it described as an original law. We call it Dene law. Many communities have their Indigenous traditional terms on how they describe this. But I use natural or first law because this tends to be most ubiquitous within the English language, at least from a scholarship standpoint. And natural or first law is the way of living on land, handed down through countless generations, and it sustains a web of relationships between the human and non-human world and forms a pattern which is life itself. And this pattern must be recreated and the law followed to sustain life. Now, Indigenous traditional knowledges actually come from, they're born, their foundation within concepts of natural law within our community. From Indigenous traditional knowledges, we have traditional protocols that ensure the respect of those Indigenous traditional knowledges as well as natural or first law. traditional protocols allow us to have healthy communities and ecosystems. So when we think back to this picture, this embodiment of health communities and ecosystems, they're embodied by Indigenous applications of what we consider planetary health, which is those values embodied within respective communities that are based on traditional knowledges through an action through traditional protocols, but fundamentally lie at the basis of our natural or first laws. This is probably the most simplistic description of our way
up to the stage.
of being
The floor
and
is all
knowing
yours.
in the world. I'm Dene. Dene peoples. De, as part of that name, means flow. Ne means the land. So Dene means flowing from the land. We are flowing from the land as Dene peoples. We are a part of that. And it creates our culture, it creates our teaching, it makes who we are as part of that. And if you ask Indigenous communities the actual definition of their name, almost always it will be some embodiment of the lands around them. Now, Heather had stated that Indigenous people currently host in areas and live with 80% of the world's biodiversity. But I want to contextualize that a little bit. Indigenous peoples make up 6% of the world's population right now. 6% of the global population hosts 80% of the world's biodiversity. Perhaps we're doing something right. Now, a little while ago, beginning of 2021, we brought together a group of Indigenous scholars, practitioners, land defenders, knowledge holders around the globe representing Indigenous peoples across all continents. And we wanted to define what we called the determinants of planetary health. Everybody's heard probably of the social determinants of health, the places we live, work, all of these, components that make up our overall well-being. But one thing that's inherent within the social determinants or ecological determinants of health is the center point is always people. It's people that are at the center of that. And that's not a bad thing. And I'm not saying that that's a bad thing. But what we wanted to do is, for once, put Mother Earth within the center and ask, what is it that makes Mother Earth well? What is it that Mother Earth needs for her well-being? And we conceptualized the determinants of planetary health. And through this work, we determined 3 interconnecting levels through a consensus process: Mother Earth level determinants, interconnecting level determinants, and Indigenous peoples level determinants. And there was 10 individual determinants that were identified to be absolutely key and fundamental for the health and wellness of our planet and the way to move forward, a roadmap, so to speak, of understanding from Indigenous traditional knowledges that spread the globe. I want to highlight one particular one, which is the human interconnectedness within nature, because I've broached this a few times. And the reason why I highlight this one continually, and why you'll see the planetary health education framework centering interconnection within nature, is because of this. Ecological demise points to an impaired human relationship with its inner self. Humans are nature and not apart from it. In the broader sense, there is evidence of the loss of an ecologically bound cultural identity. The disconnect from nature manifests as a fragmented and disassociated identity that cannot recognize itself as part of a system, making it easier to project predatory and abusive impulses onto the environment. Thus, an ideology of independence has resulted in a sense of entitled ownership, a kind of utilitarian perception of the natural world that relates to it through transactional relationships that do not have a sense of responsibility, care, or love. And this worldview will only continue to perpetuate planetary harm. Now, the other less appreciated determinant of planetary health that I want to highlight is that of Indigenous people's health. And folks will go, well, what does Indigenous people's health have to do with the health of the planet? And we premised strongly within our group's work that the planet is intrinsically tied to the health of Indigenous peoples. Because when Indigenous peoples have their health and well-being, when they have their land and sovereignty, they're better able to care for more than 1/3 of the remaining old-growth forests and 80% of the remaining world biodiversity. It is imperative that Indigenous peoples' health be looked at from a holistic lens, not only for their well-being and the well-being of their communities, but the well-being of the planet. We ended our paper saying that Indigenous voices are a powerful and beneficial solutions-oriented force for Mother Earth's well-being and for all living beings that inhabit her. We therefore call for an inclusion of wisdom that is not mere knowledge or information, but is an insight that comes from the heart of Mother Earth. I want to end with a quote from an elder from my younger sister's work on land-based healing, which is the embodiment of what we're seeing now within our communities, is a reconnected space, a revitalization of this interconnection between land and people, because land is an active participant in the education process, but also the healing process of people, and not just something that you go out on. They are an active participant. Land-based is one of those words. It's a beautiful, wonderful term. It's bringing people back to the land and helping them become alive and remembering their humanity and their connection to all living things. We are the land. So if we remember who we are, then the same miracle that we see all around us will be us. So with that, I say Masi Cho, which is a big thank you, but it's not just a big thank you. If you'll go up to the Northwest Territories ever, you'll hear a lot of names like the Mackenzie River is De Cho, the Great Slave Lake is Tu Cho. So Cho is added for what a lot of people think is because of the meaning big. But Cho is actually added because it's an honor term. The river is an honor, the lake is an honor, this thank you is an honor. Masi Cho.
Thanks. Okay, perfect. You guys can hear me okay? Yeah, okay, awesome. So first of all, thank you so much, Kim, for this invitation. It's a real privilege and honor to be here. And I was telling Kim before that, you know, when I got the appointment of Director of Planetary Health, which a lot of people acknowledge sounds like a pretty good title, one of the first people I spoke to was Dr. Redvers. And again, it was, I mean, you just heard like what a great talk. I affirmed in my head that I will never agree to speaking after you again. But one of the things that was very clear, and I think should be very clear to all of us, is that this whole notion of planetary health, it's not new. It's been around for thousands of years, and Indigenous people really have been living that value. As a healthcare professional, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story, but this is something I'm just waking up to, and it's something that I think I'd say a lot of my colleagues are just waking up to. So again, thank you. So my talk is around kind of, I guess, my own personal journey a little bit with eco-anxiety and kind of turning that into eco-action, because I think we heard earlier today from multiple speakers, you know, Dr. Picard and Dr. Villeneuve kind of saying like, hey, you know, it's good to dwell on some of the things that are going on because I think we need that knowledge base, but it's also good to think about the things that we can do to start adapting and mitigating these issues. I asked Kim before this talk earlier this week find out who would be coming so I'd know what the audience was like. And I heard it was a bunch of, there's going to be a lot of academics and some students. And that's a little bit intimidating too, because I have very good friends who are academics. And I can tell you that I am definitely, kind of at the bottom in terms of intellectual ability. So it's kind of really, yeah, no, it's true. Like, so I'm really like this is kind of cool because it gets me out of the usual talking to healthcare professionals, and not that they're not smart, but talking to people who are really smart. So this is cool. My whole kind of journey. So I'm a colorectal surgeon. Most of my practice is taking out colon and rectal cancer. I also operate on like smaller things that affect quality of life, like hemorrhoids and stuff like that. And so I have surgeries that kind of go from like 5 minutes to 23 hours. And so I really love my job. I'm in a teaching center. I get to teach medical students, residents, and so, as my career evolved, one of the things I started thinking about was, how can I like affect change beyond the people that I kind of deal with every day, which is very, very meaningful. But, if there are systems of change within, my unit, my division, my department, how can I do that? So quality improvement and patient safety was that. And so what is that? Very simply, without making it a talk about QI, which I also love, it's, when people have surgery, unfortunately, there are complications that can happen. And, there's surgical site infections. People die from surgery. There's lengths of stay that we can try and shorten because that's actually decreases our resource use. I could go on, but that's really kind of what we worked on. And that's been a really rewarding part of my career. And then as things evolved, I'd been about, I started in 2013 in that space. It's about 2019. And, we had kind of gotten all these teams across our entire Department of Surgery going. We created this, vice chair position in the Department of Surgery for quality improvement and patient safety. And people were starting to kind of just lag a bit, right? It's that constant, like we talked, Dr. Picard mentioned, being relentless, right? Relentless in this pursuit of making things better all the time. And so we thought, like, what can we do to engage people a little bit more with things that are kind of relevant to society at large beyond, our surgical things? And so the opioid crisis is obviously a big thing. And actually surgeons contribute to the opioid crisis because, we prescribe opioids because people are in pain after we operate on them. And so we worked on that. We worked on a surgeon empathy project, which was pretty interesting. And then, you don't have to be super intelligent to start kind of recognizing that, like, there's a climate crisis. And that seems to be like a pretty big thing. And, when you look at Greta's story, and she was mentioned several times, and so someone who I think a lot of people know about, but when you look back at her story, one of the things at the genesis of that was this whole notion of eco-anxiety, or whatever you want to call it. I know there were 5 different terms mentioned in one of the previous presentations. I don't know the definitions of those, but there was eco-anxiety there, and that really kind of fueled some of what she ended up doing. And for me, that anxiety was there. And I was looking at things, and it's funny because, like, you heard about the IPBS report from Heather. One of my best friends, who I talk to every month, was like the lead Canadian author on that report. And still, he'd been doing stuff. He's like a Canada Research Chair at UBC. I still, that hadn't really clicked. And for some reason, as we started looking at things, it clicked. And then I started reading about stuff, and then I realized, wow, here we go. You take all of healthcare together, and we're like the 5th biggest country in terms of carbon footprint. And that actually, when I present that now to healthcare professionals, that is an astounding statistic for a lot of it. They don't know that. Actually, everything you heard today, and again, congratulations, it's been a great day. I've really enjoyed it. You probably know more now than a lot of my colleagues, like the vast majority of them. Don't get me wrong, there are some physicians, nurses, OTs, PTs, they're doing great work, but the vast majority of them, you're ahead of them. And so as you kind of consider this as a healthcare professional, you kind of go, wait a second, like this actually doesn't sit well at all, because the whole reason I went into medicine was to try and help people at its very fundamental basis, and I think that goes for a lot of healthcare professionals. And what we're doing is actually like destroying, I mean, you know, the environment and the things that people are dependent upon for their health, not only for people now, but for future generations. And so it becomes, I think, as you start waking up to this, it becomes a moral and ethical obligation, I mean, as anyone, but as a healthcare professional, to start really getting involved with this. And to me, the notion of planetary health, since I'm a pretty simple-minded guy, is that for people to do well, to live well, to have, you know, good social interactions, good mental health, they need clean air, they need clean water, they need clean soil, they need clean food. They need green spaces to live in, as we heard very eloquently again from Dr. Villeneuve. That was also another great presentation. And, you know, so that's really what it boiled down to. And with our carbon footprint in healthcare, you know, we were obviously contributing to all these bad things. And you know, I'm actually not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. I think you've heard today how basically the damage to the environment, the loss of biodiversity, climate change intersects with pretty much like every single health problem that you can think of. And, you know, as Dr. Redvers put it, like, we are nature. And I think it's of no surprise that it intersects with all these things. So when it, you know, so we kind of, in the Department of Surgery, so started doing stuff to try and reduce our carbon footprint. And then I think I was, you know, I started reading about this stuff and I couldn't believe it. And so I'd start emailing people, and you know, I don't really, I guess at this point in time, I'm old. I don't care who I email. So I'd email the CEO, I'd email like the vice deans of the university, and I'd be like, you know, what are we doing? Like, this is a problem, and I've been blind to this for so long, but I'm gonna unblind you, and then you better give me a good answer as to what you're gonna do. And so I think to maybe, you know, and the dean of the Faculty of Medicine, he's a great person. And has a lot of vision, and actually he created the director of Planetary Health role, and so then I took that over, and I think, you know, there's two big boxes in my head. Again, I'm a very, like, I'm not saying that's right. It's just I'm simple-minded. I need things in like boxes that I can understand. And there's adaptation stuff, and there's mitigation stuff. And so in terms of adaptation, one of the really big things, and there's multiple things in adaptation, but, you know, I'm not going to stand up here and talk for hours, and actually I don't have the knowledge base to anyway. But in terms of adaptation, you know, one of the big things is education. And so, you know, you heard earlier about, you know, again, this relentless approach. And so right now, and you heard a stat, I can't remember who gave it, but like, it was like, you know, there's like 11% of medical students who said they'd never even heard about this. And this is the biggest, you know, climate change is the biggest threat to human health right now, as recognized by multiple international health organizations. So for those other medical students that actually hear about it, like, how do they hear about it? Well, it turns out, like, they get like a 2-hour lecture, and that kind of ticks the box. But again, with that relentless type of approach, when you look at kind of what represents best practice, it's more of a longitudinal approach where, you know, again, I think it was Dr. Picard saying like that, drip, 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 drip. That's what we're trying to do, and that's actually what we've got an agreement now with the University of Ottawa Faculty of Medicine, is that it's not going to be the, you know, 2 hours of here's everything you need to know about planetary health and climate change. It's going to be, you know, you talk about, you know, you have the respirology lecture, there's something in there. You have the psychiatry lecture, there's something in there. You have the infectious disease something, there's something in there. Reproductive health, there, you know, I could go on. You get the message here. So that is going to be our approach. And again, you know, we're partnering with kind of global organizations to be a part of the process. So that way, you know, when faculty don't feel comfortable about presenting, because let's be honest, I mean, I see some really young people in the room, like old people like me weren't taught about carbon footprint and climate change. Like, a lot. So it was maybe mentioned once, but we don't have that kind of knowledge base to go out there and be confident about it. But now we can give this to people. And so there's really no kind of excuse. And for example, one of the things, and I've, I talked to the CEO of the Royal College about this. So I happened to, my training is I did general surgery, then I did a fellowship in minimally invasive surgery, then I did a fellowship in colorectal surgery, and that's kind of how I ended up as a colorectal surgeon. You always start with general surgery. Well, so I happened to put together, there's 8 of us around the country who put together the licensing exam for general surgery. And you know what? Climate change, again, biggest health threat to humanity. I can't test on it because it doesn't show up on any of the kind of things that a general surgeon is supposed to know. And I would argue that that makes no sense. And I know there's a lot of competing priorities, but when you're talking about really important things like this, we kind of need everyone on board. And I also sit on it for colorectal surgery, same problem. So again, I've complained about that as well. And then there's the mitigation strategies. And again, these are everywhere. So if you take the operating room here, this is from a friend of mine who's a surgeon at the NHS. And again, you look at, okay, take colorectal surgery. So I do colorectal cancer. Well, we know most cancer starts as polyps. So from a public health perspective, in terms of those brainstorming ideas, well, if we are able to screen people better, provide better quality, let's say colonoscopy or fecal tests, whatever, and we catch things within a polyp, and that's a lot less carbon intensive, removing something like that way, than doing a massive 20-hour surgery. So there are things like that. In the operating room, guess what? When people go to sleep, they get greenhouse gases put them to sleep. And actually, some of those greenhouse gases are terrible for the environment. There's a anesthetic gas called desflurane that happens to have let's call it 10,000 or 40,000 times the warming capacity of carbon dioxide. And actually, nitrous oxide is really bad too. But again, that is starting to become apparent. And the anesthesiologists at the Ottawa Hospital, they've essentially now almost banned that gas. So things can happen when people know about it. And then when we talk about the actual surgery itself, why do we need to use disposable instruments? That happens a lot. And it's been found that reusables can be used without an increased risk of surgical site infection. Because of course, again, coming from a quality and patient safety lens, how people do is at the center of all this. But if we can do things that are better for the planet and still are just as good for people, then that's a really good thing. And so, there are all these things that, right now, one of the other things in terms of disposables in the operating room is we use disposable gowns. We use disposable drapes. At the end of every surgery, there are garbage bags full of these things, and it's terrible. And actually, the literature's out there saying this is better. So it's better to have reusables, even when you consider the laundering, and the transport if you don't have laundry on site. So again, it's good. People are receptive. I've met with our chief procurement officer and the senior VP in charge of that, and we're going to look at that and we're going to see. But again, it's everywhere. And then it's in places you might not think. One of the things we did in our Department of Surgery was digital faxing. So my office, for example, over 1 year, we used 50,000 sheets of paper because, hey, when someone sends a referral, it was paper. We've switched over to digital faxing. And it was amazing. We have infrastructure to drive change in quality, but it was incredible by finding some metrics that we could find, the number of, e-faxes that come through. We had a page with some simple to watch videos for surgeons as well as admin assistants. And it's everyone in the department's taking it on. And guess what? Now, actually, we were gonna, we there was a urologist who was leading it, took it to senior administration, and now it's pretty much throughout the entire hospital. So, you think about the millions of sheets a day. Sometimes you need evidence to guide policy, as was mentioned earlier, but sometimes actually you don't, and you can just make changes. And there's a lot of these examples within the healthcare system that kind of support that. another thing is food. So, when patients obviously are in the hospital, they get food, right? I mean, they need it. And 50% of that food gets wasted. And so, I mean, I could try and kind of go on about that a little bit, but there's a little video. And before you start the video, just in terms of like, I know there's some like, I mean, I'm looking at people, I don't want to judge ages, but there are some very young people I'm seeing here. And in terms of what you can do is, I would say, don't be afraid to reach out to leaders. It's amazing how receptive I find leadership is to voices of people that are much younger and that are making a lot of sense, because you guys have a lot of passion for this. Like, for example, this video, so I ended up getting this video from a talk that I watched by Laurie Nickel, who's the CEO of Second Harvest. And she had come to, so my older daughter was organizing like a speaker series over the school year on sustainable development goals. So she was food. And she actually showed this video, which was really cool. But also, again, because when I was watching, before I talked to Dr. Redvers, I watched a video that of a talk she had done at the University of Minnesota. And again, I should have picked up then not to go after you today. But my older daughter started watching that, and actually Nicole Redvers came, and actually Mark Carney came to that speaker series. And so, like, it's amazing how powerful your voices are compared to like someone who's like old like me. And so I think I would use that voice as effectively as you can, and especially with the education that you are getting here. I think I think it could be very powerful. So, are we set to roll the video? So this is like a test of whether you have a soul or not. Because if you don't get attached to the strawberries at the end of this video, then we're gonna have to have a chat. So.
Sweet baby, I'll travel the world for you. I love you.
Can we get strawberries?
No, honey.
Please.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a pretty effective video. And so, when 50% of the food gets thrown out on my post-operative patients, that's a problem. And that's a problem we need to fix. And also, again, if you look at the diet that is offered within a hospital, the predilection to a non-plant-based diet is significant. And there's no reason for that, actually. I have, like, again, speaking with, there's a friend of mine who's a big advocate for plant-based diets in the UK within the NHS. And one of the biggest things she runs into is this whole notion of, we can't do it because it takes away people's autonomy. And, again, I think Trevor Hancock has written about, the precautionary principle when it comes to crises. And I think when we're dealing with a climate crisis, it's okay if people don't get meat when they're in hospital for a little while. If you ever want some, we talked about effective media earlier today. Just a plug for another Canadian, Joanne MacArthur. She is awesome. So COP26 had a photojournalism competition. She was the winner. And her books are awesome. Like the pictures they are harrowing. But man, I mean, you want to get a point across, the pictures in those books, they're like, I'm starting to give that actually now. It's like the coffee table book, Hidden, has become my kind of go-to present for people, and I think I'm going to send one to the CEO of TOH. Although he did put out a very nice Earth Day message, so they're moving in the right direction. So again, I say all this, and I think, as I mentioned, there are things that are happening. So like I just kind of came onto this whole notion of planetary health in the last like 3 years, I would say. Part of it's reframing. Like I think all the quality improvement and patient safety stuff that I was doing, I think that's planetary health. Like I think if I reduce costs, like if every surgical site infection costs somewhere between $20,000 to $50,000, money is usually kind of, not always, but most of the time related to carbon intensity. So, you're spending $50,000, there's some carbon intensity that goes along with dealing with that complication. So some of it's reframing for also our teams, because we have multidisciplinary teams. That's one big thing, we took away, is that to solve a problem, you get a bunch of doctors in a room. That's actually like a really bad way of doing things. You need that multidisciplinary team with like OT, PT, the housekeeper. You need all those people together solving problems. And, it does, like being in a forum like this really gives me hope as well when I hear some of the amazing work that's going on. Again, like it does give me hope. I gave you that example, about doing the exams, and actually we just examined yesterday for general surgery, and the fact that it's not in there. But today, actually, when I got here, I was here early and there was a bit of a delay, so I opened my iPad, and lo and behold, I had my contract from the Royal College saying we've created a clinician educator role in planetary health. And so guess what? That'll be me, and that'll be cool, and hopefully affect some change there. So things are changing. Like our the strategic plan for the Ottawa Hospital that's coming out is going to include sustainable healthcare as one of its guiding principles, and looking out for not only our patients that are in front of us, but for future generations. So a lot of people today, they've kind of ended things with really nice quotes. So I feel now compelled through peer pressure to do the same thing. And so, yeah, we heard about Elon Musk today a lot, and I know he talks about, us having another planet maybe to go to. I don't think there's a planet B. And, again, to kind of another shout out to a Canadian, although he's passed away, Marshall McLuhan, a Canadian philosopher. I think he had a great quote. And that is that on Spaceship Earth, there are no passengers. We are all crew. And I think, this crew today is pretty good. I think we can do some good things. And thank you for having me here. I appreciate it.
Well, that was a fantastic talk and a fantastic panel. We do have plenty of time for questions, so I will go ahead and open it up. Our panelists are going to come sit up at the front. We also have Dr. Casselden still with us on Zoom, I believe. So does anyone have any questions?
Thank you so much for those fantastic presentations. Dr. Malou, I have a question for you. Can you comment on the increased medical waste during the COVID-19 pandemic and what you foresee or have seen coming from that?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it's a question that's come up a lot. I think everyone was kind of in a reactive type mode when it all started, and I think because of that, there's been studies on the amount of waste that was generated. Through the gowns and stuff like that, it's ridiculous. But I think what's happening now, and again, like I said, what gives me hope is you've got all these organizations now who are working towards changes, right? So for example, in BC, and they're really lucky because, so they're partnering with like Arc'teryx, because Arc'teryx is a Canadian company, and working on kind of gowns that again can be like reused, and like even with the, I was talking about in the OR right now, I wear a disposable gown, which I trash at the end of the case. And one of the things about those gowns, if we switch to reusables, is the fact that, you can only launder it so many times for when we're in the operating room because, after like 9 or 10 washes, it just doesn't, I don't know, it doesn't have the barrier to like stop the blood from going through the gown or something. But you can take those gowns and use them in like less intense areas. So like, for example, right now, even when I go to do a colonoscopy, I'm wearing a disposable gown. But those gowns can be used in colonoscopy for like tons of time. And same thing like on the floor when we're going to see someone, it's the same thing. So I think it's just everyone realized, I think even hospital administrators realized like what a massive waste there was and how it's contributing to stuff. And so hopefully, I hope we don't, again, like I don't think there's going to be a monkeypox epidemic or anything like that. But, I think we'll be able to, I think we'll be in a better spot next time where there won't be as much waste. Do you think it has like sparked innovation almost? I think so. Like, I think that sparked innovation. I think also, like I said, it's super old notion, right? Like it's thousands of years of knowledge in terms of planetary health. It was like this Lancet kind of series, and it was 2015, I think, right? When it came out, like that's what really started sparking like more kind of Western medicine interest in this. And so since then, I think there's a lot more thought around, around what we can do to be just better and actually look after people better at the end of the day.
Thank you for your presentations. They were both all three very interesting. This is also for Dr. Malou. I was just wondering, your stance seems very progressive on this planetary insights in healthcare. And as someone who's worked briefly in healthcare throughout being a student, it's definitely something I've noticed. And I was just wondering, like nationally, as well as maybe in the States, you were talking about the NHS, I'm sure you have lots of connections. Is this happening everywhere? Are you you sound very progressive. What's the stance? What's the landscape like across our country and beyond in developed nations? So
again, another really good question. So, when I first got this appointment, again, it was 3 years ago. The Lancet Commission comes out in 2015. I tried to meet with people who were just a lot smarter than me or might be knowing stuff more. So obviously, I met with Nicole, and that was great conversation, right? Because it really just even life-wise, when I take walks, it's a lot different now, kind of thinking of myself as everything being my relative. It's like really cool. And I taught my kids that too. But so then I went to other organizations, like the American College of Surgeons, for example, is the biggest surgical organization in the world. They have hundreds of thousands of members. So I thought, oh, you know what? They're going to have something for sure. So I talked to the director because I knew him through QI stuff I'd done. And I was like, hey, what are you guys doing? And he's like, what is planetary health? And so now we're trying to build something there. But the short answer to a question is, I think there are it is starting to shift, but I think I don't know, Nicole, you speak about this way more than I do. What's your sense on this?
Yeah, it's very different depending on the country. So the UK is the most advanced for sure, at least from a, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know, will that work?
Can you hear me? Okay. The UK is much more advanced in terms of a health system perspective, and they've set targets for net zero way faster than everybody else. There's a difference between the practice standpoint and the education standpoint. So from a practice and implementation standpoint, UK is far ahead. There's specific institutes that exist in North America that are also like the Kaiser Foundation, for example, in the US, and there's a number of other ones that have really moved ahead of the game. When it comes to the education standpoint, most of that started within the last probably 3 to 4 years out of the Center for Sustainable Healthcare, which is based out of Oxford. But that inspired many different hubs in various places, including Columbia University. The AFMC in Canada now has a task force on climate and health that I sit on, and we're in the process of looking at national curriculum development for medical professionals. They have a declaration committee on planetary health that started now. The Planetary Health Alliance in the US, based out of Harvard, has a Clinicians for Planetary Health, which is transdisciplinary, including nurses and physicians and many different healthcare providers. There's a network of people that are available through the Planetary Health Alliance, Hilo page it's called, that is a network of global providers that are on this, including Wonka for the Environment, which has been moving a lot with some of the sustainable work that Zane was talking about. There's lots of pockets. Only probably the last 2 years has it really started to amalgamate into a unified voice. Everybody was kind of siloed off into different spaces doing their own things. But it's the first time, I think, in the last even 18 months where there's really been this unification of voices across the globe. And because of that, it's spurring much more change in various spaces. So it's slowly starting. I mean, even the position, UBC now has, a planetary healthcare lab. There's another institution in Canada that's going to be starting that too soon. Stanford, a lot of the Ivy Leagues, funny enough, it's kind of disappointing. It'd be nice to see other institutions. University of Minnesota has been a leader in terms of nursing curriculum development in planetary health, and they're launching a unified alignment of their competencies to planetary health competencies as well. So there's stuff out there. It's just a matter of kind of putting the pieces together. Germany also is quite advanced as well in terms of some of this work.
If I might also just pipe in and comment, it's Heather speaking, Heather Casselden.
No, it's the voice of God.
Mystery voice. So just on the topic of education, a team that I was leading did a study that looked at public health programs, graduate level programs across Canada around to what extent are our educational institutions in public health addressing climate change in teaching their students. And our findings highlight the need for these graduate programs to radically reform their curriculum to address this new frontier in public health. Because one of the core functions of public health is emergency preparedness, and climate change is our biggest global emergency. And the clock's ticking, and we need to do more. And the response of our education programs is sluggish at best.
And I will additionally note that almost all of the initiatives that have happened so far, barring recent, have not been inclusive of other ways of knowing. A complete lack of social justice issues, equity as a part of those conversations. That's changing slowly but surely, but it is still a struggle outside of the mechanistic sort of processes to be more inclusive of other ways. So I just wanted to add that too.
Hi, thank you so much for all of your words. They were very profound. This question is for Nicole and Heather. So I'm really interested in kind of your talking about the natural law, especially since I've kind of lived abroad, and I find that nature, now living in Canada, there's a lot of benefits to living here, but we live in suburban lifestyles where we live in cookie cutter homes and we don't see nature the same way. So I was just wondering, how do you think we can incorporate natural law into our very busy, very modern, fast-paced lives?
Looking at the voice from the ceiling. Heather, I don't know if you're wanting to jump in before me.
I only had one sort of a preliminary thought, and there was something that I was speaking with Melissa Lem, who's involved with the physicians. I can't remember their acronym, but Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. That's right, CAPE. And she was describing. So there's the nature-based prescription approach that CAPE is leading. But more specifically in the urban context, this really needs to involve urban planners. So urban planners really need to be ahead of the curve in thinking about urban design, because so many of us live in urban contexts. And she was describing this something like, out your front window, you should see at least three trees. And then there was another scale of like, and in 30% tree coverage minimum in your area, and then another 300, and I forget what the 300 was, but 330 and 300 is just like a basic way of thinking about how can we in our own backyards start to address how to deal with climate change is one strategy. But the urban planning people really need to be engaging with people who are on the forefront of health and climate change and having those conversations, not just in silos, but, you know, we've heard talk about the transdisciplinarity approach is how we need to be addressing climate change action now. Those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Heather. Just a few pieces. One of the chapters within my book, The Science of the Sacred, I talk a little bit about that because, at least from a literature standpoint or a scholarship standpoint, you know, evidence suggests what Heather noted, but also even having a picture of nature in your home, having plants in your home. It's how you look and interact with those items. It's the relationship that you see to them, not necessarily, you know, having that green yard if you're not able to afford the landscape space to be able to do that. And I think we minimize the importance of just some of those simple things and how we actually see that plant within our home and actually looking at it and spending time just being in completion with that plant. And that changes sometimes even your mood of looking within that. Those are easy interventions that can be done, you know, and I would love to see public health interventions where we actually provide houseplants to folks that are not able to be near green space because of some of the issues that Heather talked about. The other thing I'll note briefly is that in Yellowknife, about 3 to 4 years, well, actually 4 years ago now, we founded a charity called the Arctic Indigenous Wellness Foundation, and we opened the first land-based urban healing camp, which was a healing space meant to be land-based, but within an urban area that people could come and have the embodiment as if they were on a land-based out in the bush or the woods, but may not necessarily have had the economic abilities to get out of the town center. It's been in operation for 4 years, all year round within Yellowknife, which is not that warm. So if it can be done there, it can be done anywhere. We have elders, people at the camp, we provide bush tea, there's no power, it is a land site. And it's been absolutely amazing to see the ability of reconnection happen even within very busy urban spaces. Yellowknife's not Toronto by any means, but the park space that we have it in is very similar to any of the park spaces that would be around here. Because what we say within land-based healing is it's not necessarily the land itself, it's the relationship and the intentionality that you place on that land space. And if you look at the definition of land-based healing that a lot of communities will derive, it's a spiritually cultivated place of healing. And that can be very broad in terms of it, but it's an intentional space where you recognize that that piece of land is a relationship to you, and it embodies the ability to teach and heal by just being on it. So I think we need to simplify our notions of what being in nature is, because again, we are of nature, and remembering those small interconnections that we can have on a day-to-day basis. Merci.
Hello. Okay. So my question is for the third speaker. My question is, okay, so there's a lot of communication about young people being passionate about climate change and reaching out to leaders. Could we reach out to leaders with ideas that we have?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I'll give you a personal example without sounding like I'm like a big braggart. My younger daughter, she's 16. And I would say, you know, I mean, I don't know, hopefully she'll never watch this YouTube video, but she's baseline smart. She's not like super smart or anything. Okay. So, so she has ideas, right? Like she cares about the environment and has ideas about how to make things better. So she's looking at the energy space. And so she has two big ideas. One is bioplastics, you know, from second generation kind of feedstock. So it's not, you know, like not corn and stuff like that. And that's why she thinks it's better. And she also has another one on a transparent solar cell, which again, she's hopefully going to build that out. Now, She's building the solar cell out hopefully at Ryerson University, and she got a grant for it. She's doing the bioplastic stuff just next door here with Dr. Barry's lab, and Dr. Avey is helping her as well. Now, how did she come to any of these ideas? So she had ideas, she read about it. She then actually on LinkedIn, and I was telling Kim actually, LinkedIn has restored my faith in humanity a little bit in terms of like people respond and people who are experts respond. So she actually has had like tons of conversations with like leaders in each of these areas. She's actually got an internship with like this bioplastic like leading company in the world. Like it's called Pond Bioplastic in Denmark. Again, it's this ability to reach out, talk to people with ideas. They want to listen. So the CEO and CTO jump on like a sync once a week with her to chat about things. And so again, it's like, it's leveraging like the world in some ways through all our technology has become much smaller, and we can access like thought leaders. Like, how did I chat with Nicole? Like she wasn't in Chelsea yet. And yet like through like watching this and talking to this person, all of a sudden they're like, oh yeah, you got to talk to Nicole Redvers. And I was like, I watched her video. I'm like, yeah, I got to talk to Nicole Redvers. And so I reached out, and Nicole Redvers talked to me. Like, that was so cool, right? Now I'm on a panel with her. Like, that's it, man. I've made it. So it's like, you know, like it's kind of like that. Like, I think
I'm only from the Northwest Territories.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah. But I mean, that's one example of technology and kind of harnessing, again, really smart people. But I think you can do that with any idea you have. And I think people are receptive, at least in this space. I don't know if that answers your question at all. Yeah, okay.
She sounds super baseline smart. Like, I'm going to have to turn in my PhD after hearing that.
Hi, this question is for Dr. Revers. Sorry, I don't have a sheet in front of me. I was wondering, so at least in my experience in academia, and I'm coming back to it out of the workforce after a long time, there's a lot of like very traditional Eurocentric mindsets around what is, you know, legitimate research to cite in a thesis, what are legitimate research methods. And, you know, for me, like I am very interested in the Indigenous ways of knowing. I did the Indigenous Learning Certificate here, and it really opened my eyes a lot to this different way of looking at things. And, you know, you're talking about Indigenous research methodologies, which I haven't even come across that idea yet. But when we're dealing with, you know, people in academia, say supervisors or advisors who are a little bit more, you know, old school in their views and really believe in the, like, this person has to be cited by these fancy people, this person's alma mater has to be a fancy institution. How do we overcome that as students when we're kind of in a power imbalance with those people and we want to change these things in academia? Do you have any suggestions?
Do you have 6 hours? Even a week, maybe? It's a huge question and something we tackle with every day. From your position, but as Indigenous scholars within institutions. And I practiced clinically for 10 years before going into academia because of the frustration of seeing patients not getting well because of structural issues, not because of the care that was being received within the clinical exam room. And the jump to academia was an interesting one for sure. One thing that I've realized over the last while, and because you'll get that question a lot, you know, and I often say, you know, evidence for whose ways, whose evidence? My elder in Decolonized could care less about, you know, this and that. And the funny thing when, you know, people provide comments like that is, I often just sit there and said, you know, very, very sort of quietly at first, normally, if I dropped you in the middle of the woods, how long would you last? That's what I say. And I say that your knowledge is not going to get us through what we need to do. and it's time to open the eyes a little bit. So we are constantly fighting. My answer to that question, we wrote a paper on education for sustainable healthcare that came from an Indigenous perspective, and we had a number of recommendations on there. And for institutions wide, we need more Indigenous faculty within medical programs and health systems widely. That is an absolute key and fundamental issue that we have that provides a barrier for that, because what I've realized throughout is that many faculty that are even interested in Indigenous ways of knowing or methods have zero knowledge on that, in which case they have students that they're trying to advise. They don't have connections to communities because institutions haven't done that properly and put the time invested to do that, to provide learning opportunities, not only for their Indigenous students, but also for all students, to ensure that they have opportunities to think holistically about ways of knowing and how we can apply those to greater systems and solutions. Like I said, I think we could probably talk about this for 6 hours because we deal with this on a constant basis, and I have many ideas for solutions that unfortunately won't have the time parameters to talk about today. But if anything, if people want to do something, advocate for Indigenous faculty within your schools and programs. Advocate for it as students, advocate for it as other faculty. Advocate, advocate, advocate. We need people at those tables in the institutions, otherwise it will not change. We need presence within those spaces. But with that, I have to go meet 2 kids on a bus. So I'm gonna just jet out, apologize for rushing off, but really thanks for the opportunity to be with you all today. Masicho.
Are we done? We're done, right? Oh, go on. Sure.
This is actually for all of you, but first of all, thank you so much for your words. They were super eye-opening. My question is, what do you say and what do you do to not only let people hear, but really feel the message? What really works? What's effective? And what can we as individuals bring to our families, our friends, and our peers so that they can really understand?
Heather, did you want to answer this first?
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. I think, one of the things that I always think of is, as a geographer, I'm a geographer, and so I think about our relationship to place. And I think when we're making decisions about, for example, clear cutting a forest, that decision doesn't get made in a boardroom. It should be made in the forest after you've spent some time in the forest in relationship to the trees that you're about to harvest. So I think, having conversations with people, family, friends, not necessarily just around a dinner table or something like that, but out in the places that you're talking about, and, thinking about why is this place special to you, and what can you do? What little things can you do to take care of the land that you're on, and steward it in a good way. So yeah, I think bringing people together and face-to-face conversation is so important, and we've really lost that. I'm zooming in, right? But being able to have those face-to-face conversations out on the land is so important. And we've lost it with the pandemic, and we're slowly starting to regain it, while the pandemic is still alive. So that's one thought I had. I don't know if that helps, but there you go.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'll throw in something really quickly here, because I like to shout out Canadians, very Canadian-centric point of view. Catherine Hayhoe, she's a climate scientist, probably one of the most famous climate scientists. Oh, really? There you go. See, she was supposed to be here instead of me, is what I just found out. But but she couldn't come. So she wrote this great book. It's called Saving Us. It's actually all about communicating this. It talks about a lot of different things. One of her biggest messages, and I mean, you should read the book. Obviously, is way better than hearing me paraphrase it. So one of the biggest things at the end was hey, okay, you've reached the end of this book. What can you do about it? It's talk about it. And when you talk about it, try and contextualize it so it actually so when when I'm talking to people in Ottawa now, we can bring up multiple examples of the way climate change is affecting us. Or if you're talking to people who are like camping enthusiasts, it's like, well, hey, if you don't care about this, but guess what? Like, you know, those camping places you like, yeah, I don't know how much longer you're going to get there for. Or you like skiing, you're going to have problems. So, I mean, in pretty much every facet of life, just like it is with every organ system, it intersects. And so I think taking those intersections and leveraging them can be a pretty powerful thing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Last question of the day.
This one's actually for Dr. Malou. And I'm sorry to put you on the spot for this. One, you're not old. I hate to break it to you.
Thank you.
Two, I mean, it's great the work you're doing, and it's fantastic to see people working to integrate, you know, the whole concept of climate change into our healthcare systems. But did you get to have any say or input into what's happening with Ottawa Hospital? I mean, I ride through that every day, and they've already cut down the trees, and the approval isn't even fully, the funding isn't fully there. And they could have put it in a place that's more accessible, that didn't involve cutting down swaths of trees and taking up more green space. So what role did physicians have? And what say did they have in terms of health and public health in making a decision like this?
So I think that's a great question where, again, as Dr. Picard had mentioned earlier, you know, sometimes the I don't know answer is all you have. And with this, I'll be honest, I don't know how much physicians were actually involved with like the actual site selection. Like by the time we finally got a green committee together at the hospital, but like I didn't even know the trees had been cut down, to be honest with you, but like that ship is kind of, it's sailed, and you're right. There's like hundreds of millions of dollars in funding that hospital still needs to kind of happen. To put it in perspective, kind of like there was a meeting at the Board of Governors around the new hospital, and it was from some consultants, and I was there too, and was supposed to speak, but actually it was all the consultants who spoke about the new hospital, and basically it's meeting a lot of, I guess, LEED standards and building standards and things like that, so it'll be more environmentally friendly that way. But in terms of the actual impact on the local ecosystem, that wasn't addressed there. And certainly, like, again, the carbon footprint of like a hospital, like 60 to 70% of it actually isn't from infrastructure. It's from like the day-to-day decisions that people are making, like healthcare professionals, as well as administrators. That's kind of been what I've been trying to have my kind of piece there. But I think you bring up something really important, and probably, you know, I should probably know more about.
Well, I mean, and even like Paul's, you know, he presented on those, you know, just showing how the air quality is so much better around the environmental farm, and you're just going to take a huge chunk of it now. Yeah. Right. To put in more buildings when there's a space that already has buildings, and you're not going to reduce green space. Like there's just so much of our you know, community that's wondering what the heck is going on.
No, I think that's very fair, and I think, you know, more and more, like when I'm talking to senior administration, and of course not, I don't, like I said, I think this ship is sailed like years ago, unfortunately, but it's hopefully you get to a point, and again, culture, where every decision we make, whether it's on a micro, meso, or macro level, you know, we're starting to look at it with that environmental, planetary health lens. We're far away from that right now. And like you heard, there's pockets and there's stuff coming, but we're still pretty far away from that goal. Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Mulloon, that last on stage. And Dr. Casselden as well. She just sent in the chat, just so we can kind of close the loop there. The 330-300 is 3 trees from every home, 30% tree canopy cover in every neighborhood, and 300 meters from the nearest park or green space. And I have to say, where I live, we do have that until very recently. Very sadly, lost so much of our trees in our neighborhood. Devastating to see all these beautiful trees felled by the Direccio, I don't know how to pronounce it. So once again, thank you for that wonderful, wonderful panel. Super thought-provoking. I'm sitting with a lot in my space right now, acknowledging my settler space as a white visitor on this land. Thank you, Heather, for reminding us of being uncomfortable. I think we've stirred a lot of discomfort today, and I think right now is a good time to take a coffee and sugar break where we can feed our discomfort a little bit. And then please, let's take 10, 15 minutes. And then I promise we'll have some short closing remarks, some reflection pieces on today, and we'll have you out for this Friday back home to wherever that may be. Okay, thanks so much.